The dopamine that you get, the reaction from the glass of whatever you're having, is actually between 20 and 30 minutes. And then your body is desperate to get back to homeostasis. So it pumps you with this downer called dynorphin. And you cannot replicate that feel-good feeling with the second glass.
Welcome to The One You Feed. Thanks for joining us. Our guest on this episode is Christy Osborne. After passing the California bar exam, Christy relocated to London and assumed various roles in law, public relations, and business development, including working for the UK Parliament and founding a popular website for American expat women. But Christy discovered her true calling when she chose sobriety and discovered a passion for helping women on their own journeys. As a highly trained senior sobriety coach, she empowers women throughout the US and UK to redefine their relationship with alcohol. Today, Christy and Eric discuss her book, Love Life Sober, a 40-day alcohol fast to rediscover your joy, improve your health, and renew your mind. And for any listeners that don't already know, I'm very happy to say that we are now on YouTube officially, so you can watch your favorite interviews as well. Find us at The One You Feed Pod on YouTube.
Hi, Christy. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Eric. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
I'm excited to talk with you about your new book, which is called Love Life Sober, a 40-day alcohol fast to rediscover your joy, improve your health, and renew your mind. But before we get into that, we will start in the way that we customarily do, which is with the parable. And in that parable, there's a grandparent who's talking with her grandchild, and they say, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love, and the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops, and they think about it for a second. They look up at their grandparent and they say, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed. So I'd like to start off by asking you what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I was actually thinking about this, obviously, knowing I was coming on today, and I was coaching a lady this morning who I coach women who want to break free or take a break from alcohol. And we were talking a lot about this idea of creating more space. And I think when we're talking about alcohol or any addiction or any negative behavior or habit we want to change, we focus so much on not feeding, right? The bad wolf. And we don't focus so much on feeding the good wolf, but also what to feed it, right? And so, for example, with this lady this morning, when we were talking about space, it was the space to joyfully move her body and to eat healthy and to have time for herself and to begin enjoying music and all of these things. And so when we're talking about this in the scheme of, I think, alcohol, right? It's like, what can you feed the good wolf with to make yourself feel better and the person that you end up wanting to be. And so, yeah, that's what kind of I thought of today when I was preparing for today. Yeah.
I really love that response because one of the things that I got out of your book that I thought was useful was when you hear 40-day alcohol fast, it's easy to think of like a sober January or a dry, I don't know how many months now have a dry version of them associated with them, right?
Pretty much all of them.
And while that's a lovely idea, mostly what people do is just not drink for that month. And your book is really saying, let's let's use this time that yes, you're ideally not going to be drinking. But let's explore your relationship with alcohol during that time. Why are you doing it? What are you getting from it? What might the benefits of not doing it be? I mean, and your book does a great job of walking through a lot of those things. And that's why I think it's a really useful addition to this sort of dry January movement, which again is valuable. But if you just don't drink for 30 days, nothing's different. I mean, you're probably healthier in many ways at the end of it. But the way you think about the world may not be that different, whereas your program gives you an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I talk about in the book that I did all of those things, right? I did the dry Januaries, the sober Octobers, and it's exactly what you said. I ended up drinking. Nothing really changed as far as the behavior of drinking. And there was one particular dry January where February rolled around and I drank even more because I kind of had proven to myself that I didn't have a quote unquote problem. And so that I could continue on. And there was no real look at the reasons behind why I was drinking. It was just this white knuckle, figure out how to not drink for 30 days and get through it as fast as possible. And that didn't work for me. And so I obviously wanted to try something different. And what I really, really wanted to do when it got to the point where I wanted to seriously look at my drinking is I wanted to lose the desire to drink. I didn't want to have that desire. I wanted to have freedom from alcohol.
Yes. I've thought before about what did I get out of 12-step programs that helped me get sober, because I have drifted away from them over the years for a variety of different reasons. And one of the things that I got out of them that I thought was like, this is a critical component, is a method for changing the way that we view the world and think about alcohol. And that's what the 12 steps ideally will do. And so again, this is a different version of that, but there's a very clear path here to walking through that. And so I'd like to get into some of that, but first maybe just tell us a little bit about what brought you to the point.
Yeah.
What life was like when you wanted to change your relationship with alcohol.
Yeah, I grew up not drinking a lot. Like I went to USC for college in Southern California, a big Greek school. I was in a sorority, but even then it was very measured. I wanted to be very much in control. And as I kind of look back, there was definitely upticks for various reasons. I went to law school. It kind of became this way of reward at the end of a hard day of studying. And then I moved to the UK right after I graduated law school, and it was the thing that everybody was doing over here to connect, to meet new people. Then I became a mom, and then it was the thing that all the moms were doing as, again, the reward aspect of it. A long, hard day with babies, and I was alone in a foreign country with no family, and every mom that I looked at was using wine as the reward for being a mom. And so it was an incremental, slow uptick in the drinking. And I never did have this massive rock bottom moment. I've heard you tell your sobriety story, and I don't think I necessarily blew up my life. I could have gotten there. Don't get me wrong. Like, it could have gotten there. But it was this slow incremental uptick in the drinking and using it for various reasons and giving the wine various jobs. And then my own mother passed away in 2018. And growing up, she didn't drink, but in the last kind of 10 years of her life, she discovered alcohol, and it changed her. It kind of wrecked our relationship. And so her death was very traumatic for me because I was mourning the loss of this mother who was my best friend growing up, but then who we had this great chasm of distance between us when she passed. And so what did I do to manage all those really hard emotions? I drank. And it was, people always ask me, were you, the at home on the couch drinker, or were you the going out drinker? And I was both. But at the same time, it looked very similar to my friends. I didn't know anybody that didn't drink. I knew that everybody, or at least I thought I did. Thank you, social media. Thank you, Instagram, that everyone was having the wine at the end of the day because the homework was hard with the kids or to let loose on a Friday night. And so it didn't feel like it looked any different. And so that was one of the things I think that kept me stuck, right, a little bit longer. But also this idea of maybe my drinking's not bad enough. I could never, ever have pictured myself walking into an AA meeting and saying, "Hi, I'm Christy, I'm an alcoholic." I just couldn't picture it because I thought, okay, that feels like it could be a lot different than the way that I'm drinking. And so I felt really alone. I felt really, really alone and lost. And I honestly didn't feel like I had anyone to talk to. And this is in 2020, and when the Sober Curious movement, I think, is just then gaining traction. And so thankfully there was then a lot to read and learn about over the course of the pandemic when I started my work. But it was very isolating and feeling very alone and feeling like, is this something I even need to address if nobody else is? And so, yeah, that's kind of how it all started.
It's interesting you bring up my drinking story or my addiction story, because there's two parts to it. And normally part one is what I reference. Part two is I stayed sober about 8 years and I began to drink again. Mm-hmm. And I never went back to doing hard drugs, but I was drinking and I was smoking marijuana, and my bottom was not the bottom. Like I was doing well on all external measures. Mm-hmm. I'd been just promoted. I had the best job I ever had. I had a nice home. I had a nice car. I mean, all these things were okay. And yet I sort of knew I was dying inside. Yeah. And yet it was hard. It was harder for me because there was a voice that was like, oh, it's not that bad. The first time there was no sort of, like, if that voice had tried even that, I'd have been like, oh, everybody knew, like, okay, that's ridiculous. This time around, though, however, from the outside, it didn't look that bad. And yet inside was really where I was so sick. You know, I was lucky to be able to recognize I was sick as sick that time as I was the first time. It's just that circumstances had been different. But when it comes to your own recovery, let's talk a little bit about that idea of alcoholic, because I think this is one of the things the Sober Curious movement has been of the most service to the world, I think, which is to get people away from having to think of identifying as alcoholic as the way to get better. So what was it that was happening? What was it that you identified in yourself that made you say, okay, I may not be alcoholic, but I need to do something about this?
Yeah. And I want to always start this conversation by saying that, like, no, absolutely nothing against AA and the people that find that label empowering. Like, that is awesome. It's just that it doesn't work and it doesn't feel good for everybody. Right. And so, and to your point too, of everything kind of looking good and you were just promoted, you know, the morning that I stopped drinking, I was looking through my Instagram feed and I had a really popular blog for expat American women living in the UK. I had just been on Sky News to commentate for the royal wedding of Harry and Meghan, and everything was like really glossy and pretty and all of this. And like to the point that you said, it just didn't feel real or authentic. Like, I didn't feel like I was representing how I really truly felt inside. And so it was really that of just looking in the mirror one morning after a night out and just saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to feel this way. There's gotta be something that some path to get me to feeling better. And I automatically knew that the first thing that had to at least go, and I never said forever in the beginning. I didn't know what it meant. I had no idea. I didn't know if it was going to be 30 days, 16. I had no idea. I just knew that I needed a break. And so it was just kind of this, again, like a slow burn of, this feels awful. I knew I wasn't being the best mom I could be. I definitely valued, like, at the end of the day, the glass of wine over a bedtime story or hanging out with my kids, because that felt like the thing that was mine. And like, let's get those kids into bed as fast as possible so I can sit on the couch and have the wine. And it was just one of these slow things. And I just woke up and I'm like, this is not who I am. This is so inauthentic. That's not the real me that I'm portraying. And I've got to do something.
Yeah. You talk a lot in the book about sort of this mommy wine culture that's out there. Share a little bit about that, what that is. I think a lot of people will know. I mean, you go anywhere and you just see signs, like, you know, like these clever little signs that actually don't seem that clever about, you know, moms and drinking. But talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and my mommy wine culture is the pervasive messaging, right? That we as mothers need wine in order to parent because they're really hard work. And when I really drilled down on the fact that that was the message that not only I was sending my kids, but to the other people that were following me, for example, on social media, that was not the woman that I wanted to be, right? And all you have to do is literally stroll through Target and you see mommy wine culture everywhere on the tumblers and the baby onesies. And it's all about, the baby wines, WHINE. And so I wine, WINE. If you look at Etsy, I think there's, at the time of writing the book, there were 70,000 products on Etsy promoting kind of this wine culture and mommy wine culture. Yeah. And I was also the one, by the way, that gifted these tumblers and thought these were really cute and had the cocktail napkins and all. I had all of it. But it was just really drilling down to is this true? Also, is alcohol helping me be a better mom? Is that true for me? And it wasn't. And so it was challenging this idea. And during the pandemic, actually, Tropicana, the orange juice company, came out with this ad. And it was a bunch of actresses, I'll leave their names out of it, but hiding in bathrooms or the garage in order to make a mimosa. And they showed them hiding from their families and their kids. And it was the tagline of the campaign was take a me moment, as a mimosa, but for me. And I remember thinking, and I was very early into my sobriety at that point, and I was just thinking, this is not the message that we need to be sending to mothers during a global pandemic, that you should hide from your kids and drink in your closet to survive.
Yeah. Hiding your drinking is generally a bad sign. Just right across the board. That's a pretty good indicator that call yourself what you want, but you may need to examine. But I do think that is really true, that the message that's being sent there is two. First is that kids are so hard that you need a real way to cope with that. And there's some truth in the fact that parenting is difficult, right? But
100%.
The second message is that the way to cope with any difficulty is through alcohol. And we tolerate it in that sense, but there's lots of other places where if we said it that explicitly, people might be like, well, hang on a second. If I was I have such bad depression, and the thing that I do is I turn to a White Claw hard seltzer, right? Most people would look at that and be like, dude, that's a bad idea. But to say it for my taking care of my kids is a little bit different.
Yeah, and the other side of that too is, what if you switched up the drug, right? What if you said, I just need that line of cocaine or that, or that little bit of heroin in order to get me through these kids, because they're really hard work, and then that of course opens up the whole thing of, well, why are they different, and why is alcohol so socially acceptable, and why is it pushed on mothers as the thing that we need in order to parent? Yeah,
I find the whole I'm going to celebrate. And I want to be careful not to be judgmental here, right? So to each their own, right? But I have found this whole I'm celebrating my near dependence on alcohol to be a strange thing. Maybe it's that when I started, I was underage, but the last thing I wanted the world to know was that I drank all the time.
Yeah.
That was now this was a long time ago. Maybe the culture was very different. I don't know. But to me, it was never something that I was going to outwardly proclaim to the world.
Yeah.
That this is my thing. But that is very much the culture. You see it certainly in the wine mom culture. You also I see it a lot in the retired woman culture also. I see a lot of it there. It's probably lots of other places. You talk a little bit about how pervasive alcohol is in our culture, and it really is everywhere.
Yeah, it is. And to your point of this becoming this almost point of being loud and proud about, I recently saw there was an Instagram post, and it was a gal using a tumbler to go to her son's soccer game, filling it with vodka, but then putting a tea bag label hanging outside the Yeti or whatever, so that and the line was where my soccer mom's at, and it literally has, of course, millions of likes, and all these people being like, yeah, that's what I do, and I was just like, when did that happen? Because I don't remember going to my brother's soccer games and moms having Yeti tumblers of White Claw or whatever it is on the sidelines.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and I mean, the flip side of it is, right, shame it perpetrates this, right? So it's a strange thing that's sort of happening, which is, on one hand, we're celebrating being this way. And yet, on the other hand, the people who are really struggling with it, they may be superficially buying that message, but inside, they're hurt. They feel shame about how much they're drinking. So it's this weird contradiction.
It is this weird contradiction. And it also means that, you know, women have to kind of, anyone really, but I say women because I coach women, have to almost live up to this thing of keeping alcohol cute and making it look fun. But if you get hooked on it, oh my gosh, no, then you are other and there is something wrong with you. And then you have, all the things that come with that, the stigma and all of that. And so that's where obviously the shame kicks in.
Yep.
And the shame part is so important to talk about because when we're stuck in shame, we are in our survival part of our brain and we are not in our prefrontal cortex. We can't make good decisions. And so we want to get out of that place as fast as possible. And from personal experience, I know that the easy way out is wine when you're stuck in it because it makes you feel, it gets you out of, it shifts the emotion real fast.
Yeah, it is such a pernicious situation once you're in its grips, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you have alcohol, which is actively damaging your prefrontal cortex and your executive function, your ability to make good decisions. So you've got that happening. And then, like you said, you've got the shame happening, which is further shifting away from your prefrontal cortex and the ability to make decisions. And you have a great emotional strain. And the way you cope with that emotional strain is you drink. And it's easy to see how this just can, once you're in it, there tends to be no direction but down. And again, that's not for everybody, right? Plenty of people moderate just fine. And so this is not, at least from my perspective, not an alcohol is a bad thing. It's just that I think there's a lot more people struggling with it than we might know.
Yeah, 100%. And we're in a day and age now, right, where we also do know so much more about it. And there's so much research on Gen Z and the upcoming generations not drinking as much as we did because they know the health ramifications of it and they've probably seen parents struggle with it. There's the whole idea that they also have smartphones, right? So the reason that we're using alcohol maybe to connect or to have fun, they just have to open up TikTok. And so we're seeing, I think, this shift from the younger generations using it as much. But I think a lot of that has to do with everything that we're learning about how it is hard. It is hard. And moderation, plenty of people can do it, but it can be tricky once you've given alcohol jobs, right? Once you've leaned in, it's hard.
I want to come back to that giving alcohol jobs thing in 1 second. So let's grab that. But I want to ask a question because you're closer to the research on all this than I am. Are we seeing in Gen Z a drop in using substances overall, or are we seeing a drop in alcohol with marijuana maybe making up more of that gap? I'm just curious.
Yeah, definitely less alcohol. And there is research to suggest because marijuana is legal in a lot of states now and more prevalent that's had an uptick. I don't know the exact data on that, but I know that a lot of kids are drinking a lot less.
Yep.
You're drinking a lot less in college. Which is a good thing.
100%. 100%. Okay, let's come back to this line you just used, giving alcohol jobs. What does that mean when we are giving alcohol jobs?
Yeah, so when I looked back at the reasons why I was drinking, it was for connection. It was for coping, for example, for the loss of my mom. I also really believed that wine was helping me sleep because, listen, if I had 2 glasses of Cabernet, I fell asleep. I passed out. I didn't actually fall asleep. But so I was giving alcohol all these jobs. And when I looked at my why, and when I started talking through this with clients, that was one of the questions that really resonated with them. You know, I would say, well, why are you drinking? But when I said to them, what is the job that you are giving to that glass of wine? It was all of a sudden just a lot more clear of the reason kind of behind the why and all of that. And another way to ask that is, what is the unmet need? What do you actually need when you're pouring that glass of wine? Is it rest? Is it connection? Is it fun? Is it coping? Is it because there's a really hard emotion that you don't want to feel because you weren't taught to feel it? And so I just think it's a really good way of getting behind the reasons. And then you get to ask the amazing follow-up question, right? Of, is that true? Is alcohol doing that job? And I know that this is a really blanket statement and can feel really untrue to anybody that's stuck in the drinking cycle, but alcohol actually does all the opposite things of what we're drinking for, right? Disconnects us, makes us more tired, zaps our energy, spikes our cortisol, all the things.
Yep. Yeah, I always talk about addiction and substances because there's this strange nuance to them, right? The first is that when we first started using it, it may have done those jobs semi-well, right? That's thing one, right? And that this gets to the learning model of why we become dependent on substances, is that we learn over time. But the other thing is that if it didn't work at all, this would be so much easier. Like if you took a drink and you didn't feel temporarily a little bit better, it would be easy to see through this. But the fact is it continues to do something that at least initially, and my experience is that initially gets smaller and smaller, right? And the benefit gets smaller and smaller as the costs go up and up and up. But it's the fact that it does do something that makes it hard, because it would be easy to see through if it did nothing. But I think you're right. If we look honestly at anybody who's got some degree of dependence on alcohol, or any substance for that matter, because I think they're all essentially the same in this regard. There is the thing that we wanted it to do, the perfectly good reason that we may have started it, it's not the right, it doesn't fix that anymore. And like you said, it makes most everything worse over time.
Yeah, and that is so true. And this is the reason that people get stuck on it, right? And when I did the research around dopamine and dynorphin and all of the ways that our body actually chemically reacts to alcohol, this is when this massive light bulb went off for me. And I was like, oh my gosh, everybody needs to know this. And that is that feel-good feeling, the dopamine that you get, the reaction from the glass of whatever you're having, is actually between 20 and 30 minutes. And then your body is desperate to get back to homeostasis, so it pumps you with this downer called dynorphin, and you cannot replicate that feel-good feeling with the second glass. Sometimes really feels like you can, but scientifically looking at the way our brain works, you can't. And so I was like, okay, so yes, it did the thing for 20 minutes, but then it wrecked 3 days after that.
Precisely, and you keep chasing it. That's the thing, right? Because again, if you'd had one drink and afterwards you were like, oh, okay, well, that was a good feeling. It's gone. I'm not going to get it from the second drink. And you just said, okay, enough, right? You wouldn't be listening to this podcast because you'd be a normal human being probably. But those of us that relate to this go, oh, yeah, but one more will do it. One more will do it. I'll get there, right? You just keep going and the cost keeps escalating.
Yeah, 100%. And so when I kind of learned that, I was like, well, this is kind of, it became a no-brainer of why am I going to feel, and when you factor in cortisol and adrenaline and the fact that can stay raised for 7 to 10 days, then after you've even had a small amount to drink, then it's like, is the 20 minutes really worth it if you're making yourself more stressed a week later?
No, I mean, at least, that's the question I have to ask myself on not that often because it doesn't come up very often, but every once in a while I have to do that calculus in my head. Oh yeah, one drink is the best antidepressant I've ever had. And like you said, it's 20 minutes and then, wreckage.
Yeah.
Wreckage. Okay, so we've established the problem clearly enough here, I think. Let's turn ourselves to some of the things that we can do that help us to change our relationship with drinking. So we've sort of talked about the core one, which is to understand what jobs we were giving it. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, then this is the thing with all of the asking of the questions is there's so much that you can read and learn, but what I think really ends up making the change is when you do it and you feel it. When you have that experiential knowledge of, okay, I know that alcohol is going to hijack my REM sleep. And I can read all about how that works in the brain. But when I actually sleep not drinking, I can compare the two. And I think if you're a regular drinker and you haven't ever taken a significant break before, we have a lot of data, right, of what it's like to be a drinker. But we're making a lot of assumptions about what it's like being a non-drinker without having tried it. So first ask the questions and then do an experiment. Try these things. What are you assuming if you've labeled the jobs, are those jobs really true? And the thing about finding freedom from alcohol is it obviously takes work and it doesn't feel really good the very first time. And I've heard you talk about this on another podcast where 30 days might not do it.
Right. Well, sometimes it gets worse before it gets better. What can be the experience for some people? Some people start feeling better right away, but some people feel worse,
Yeah. And then it becomes, okay, so I'm using that glass of wine for connection. So that's my need. How do I really get that? And there's a lot of women that I've coached that don't know how to get that thing that they need. Fun, for example, is a really big one. It's like the only way I know how to have fun is by drinking. I don't remember what I even like to do. I coach a lot of women with that. Where I had a gal recently who went back to a pottery class or a dance class because that's what they enjoyed in high school pre-drinking. And so it's really about getting to know the things that then can fill those unmet needs that you're using for wine. And if you keep doing that in a way where you're giving yourself a ton of grace and a ton of self-compassion, and by that, I also mean if you're on a break from alcohol and you're looking at your relationship and you have a drink, you don't necessarily have to go back to day one if counting days doesn't work for you.
Right.
Let's figure out what you learned from that growth point. And so that also is super, super important because like we touched on shame briefly, right? Like that's not going to help us at all. But if we can come to a place of grace, compassion, curiosity of just, would my life be better without this? Would I feel better? How do I want to feel? How is alcohol playing into that? Go through all that in the book, but just asking the questions and doing the experiment and getting to the truth of all of it that's what helped me so much.
So listener, consider this your halfway through the episode integration reminder. Remember, knowledge is power, but only if combined with action and integration. It can be transformative to take a minute to synthesize information rather than just ingesting it in a detached way. So let's collectively take a moment to pause and reflect. What's your one big insight so far, and how can you put it into practice in your life? Seriously, just take a second, pause the audio, and reflect. It can be so powerful to have these reminders to stop and be present, candid. If you want to keep this momentum going that you built with this little exercise, I'd encourage you to get on our Good Wolf Reminders SMS list. I'll shoot you 2 texts a week with insightful little prompts and wisdom from podcast guests. They're a nice little nudge to stop and be present in your life. And they're a helpful way to not get lost in the busyness and forget what is important. You can join at oneyoufeed.net/SMS, and if you don't like them, you can get off the list really easily. So far, there are over 1,172 others from the One You Feed community on the list, and we'd love to welcome you as well. So head on over to oneyoufeed.net/SMS, and let's feed our good wolves together. Yeah, the phrase you just used there, growth point, is one that I really like because and what you mean by growth point is, let's say I'm trying to do a 40-day alcohol fast, and on day 7 I end up having a few drinks, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of looking at it as a failure, we look at that as a growth point. It's a chance to learn something, right? And I think that is really important because I think most people, if they're trying to change their relationship with a substance, are going to have lots of quote unquote what look like failures. Mm-hmm. Right? Like even everything you do up to the last time when you get I think about it, like there was a day, 15 years ago was the last time I had any substance. But there were lots of things that I tried before that didn't quote unquote work, that actually were part of getting me to whatever magic, whatever puzzle pieces clicked together 15 years ago, it was those times that I tried and it didn't work that were part of the solution. They were part of the answer. And I think that that's so important. And I think you do a great job of really highlighting that, because if we take failure to either mean we're bad people, so we feel bad about ourselves, and the way we cope with that is to drink, or we take failure to mean we can't do it, which I've known so many people who just go, I can't. You might have been able to, but I won't be able to. I can't. And I think that takes the lens that to get through that is you just haven't, at least that I think, is you just haven't figured it out yet. We haven't figured it out yet. What's your combination? What's your puzzle pieces that come together that are going to lead to you having more freedom? And I just love the way you talk about that. And I love that idea of growth point.
Yeah, I mean, I always use a couple examples. One is if you fell at like the 20-mile marker of a marathon, I'm not a runner, but would you go back to the starting line? No, you would get up and you would finish the race, right? Or for the moms out there, your little toddlers learning how to walk, they keep falling down. Do you say, you're horrible at this, stop trying? No, you say, get up and try again. Yep. And for some reason with the drinking thing, we feel like we have to make it perfect. And if we don't, and if it's not, then as you said, we're somehow failures, that we're not going to be able to do it. And then for a lot of people, this idea of you are then this alcoholic, you're never going to be able to have any fun, you're going to have to go to meetings for the rest of your life. That kind of narrative can be really scary. So so exactly what you said, it's about figuring out what works for you. And that's what I love so much about your story and also this podcast is you get to pick and choose, right? Because push comes to shove, it's about choice. And it's also, this is like beautiful work that we get to do. We don't have to do this. We get to do it. And sobriety is a gift and a blessing. It's not something that I had to do. It's something I got to do. And like, I'm so grateful that I got to do it.
Yeah, that's a really lovely reframing. And you do that a lot in the book, sort of the reframing from deprivation to what am I giving myself? Right? What are the, I'm giving myself good health. I'm giving myself better sleep. I'm giving myself more clarity instead of I'm taking this thing away from me. I always share this story because I think it's such a great one around these growth points. And it's from a client of mine. She figured this out. I did not figure it out. But she was having trouble getting to complete abstinence. And so she started this thing where every day she was sober, she put a marble in a jar. And it was amazing because what we got to see was this jar just filling up and filling up and filling up, right? And so instead of looking at the one, day, let's say it was 1 or 2 days a month that it didn't work, what we saw was this accumulation of sober days. We were focusing on the good there, not the bad. And I think that can be a really important thing to be able to do, is to recognize like, okay, I'm not perfect, but wow, I had 22 sober days last month. That's better than the month before where I had 0.
Yeah.
And that's the way some people get there, a progress like that. Other people are able to sort of just stop, but lots of people, it's more a process than that.
Yeah, and progress can look so many different ways. Like I was chatting with a client recently and we were talking about she had a few days drinking that week, but what she did was she stopped before those drinks and she actually took out her journal, right? And she wrote down why, and she she journaled through cravings and that she then would overcome and all of this. And so I said to her, she came to the call and she's like, I wasn't perfect and I drank 4 days this week or whatever it was. And I was like, wait, can we talk about that journal situation that you just read to me? Because that progress of getting behind of the why and figuring out why you're doing this and delaying the craving and all of that is such incredible progress. And to your point with the marble in the jar, there's I love that so much. Sometimes what I do with clients is I have them print out a calendar and then we highlight the days and then we take the percentage at the end. And I've also I've created a fun little celebration tracker to go along with the book, kind of similar, where let's figure out let's celebrate the wins as opposed to focusing on being perfect. So I love that so much.
Yeah, it's so important. Let's talk about Let's talk about thoughts. You talk about taking every thought captive. What do you mean by that?
So even if when we're talking about the whys, right, that's the thought, like I'm drinking to relax, or I'm drinking because I want to connect. And so the battlefield of all of this is going on in our minds, and we are not used to listening to our thoughts. We're like very used to thoughts kind of calling the shots and going along with what they say. And it's so funny because we're having this conversation relatively close to when the cute Pixar movie, now it's just fallen out of my head, Inside Out 2 has just come out, and I went with the kids, and it was just a really fun way of kind of showing what's going on in your brain. But looking at your thoughts, and your thoughts don't necessarily have to be true. We have been conditioned, like, for a number of years to believe various things about alcohol, but also various things about lots of things in our life. And so it's taking those thoughts captive and asking whether they're true or not. I work a lot with women who come with a list of like shoulds, right? I should be doing this. I have to do this. I should be doing this. I need to host this party. I have to go to run all these committees. And it's like, well, let's take that thought out and let's put some light on it and ask ourselves, is this really true? Or are you putting that on yourself? And if you're putting this expectation on yourself, how is that serving you? And so it's just getting really, really clear about what we're thinking, and which is something that we're not trained to do, and something that takes practice, and asking ourselves if that thought is true and if it's serving us or not. And if it's not serving us, why are we thinking it? Why are we holding on to it? Why are we letting ourselves mind spiral on something?
Yeah, I love that what you just said about that. You know, is it serving me? One of my favorites is just with thoughts to look and say, is this useful, right? Is this actually useful in getting me to where I want to go? Because truth is sometimes, it could go either way, right? You could be like, well, maybe, I don't know, right? But then it's like, is it useful? And I think so often we're making up the stories about things. We're giving things their meaning and interpretation. And if we can, like you said, take our thoughts out and really examine them and say, okay, is this true? And also, is it useful, right? Or is it serving me, to use your phrase? We're not trained to do it. And it's really hard to do. And the mind is really slippery. You have a lot of journaling in this book. And I assume that's why, because things in our head are slippery.
Yeah, 100%. And pulling it out, putting it on paper so that you can actually see it and examine it is a really important, I think, exercise for sure. Yeah.
Talk to me about one thing at a time. What do you mean by that?
So I think the idea of one day at a time, again, can potentially have this 12-step stigma attached to it, right? Where it is, you're white knuckling, you're going to have to be in this forever. This is going to feel hard and heavy, and you're going to be in this deprived place for the rest of your life. And so it can be really, really overwhelming to people. However, in the beginning of an alcohol-free journey, an alcohol freedom journey, it can be really, really helpful, because these hard things that we're talking about, examining our thoughts, managing cravings, all of that are actually temporary. And a good night's sleep fixes a lot of things. And so in the very beginning, one day at a time, while you're also doing this work of discovering like the reasons behind your drinking and grace and compassion, all that things that we're talking about, I think can be really, really helpful. But then what happens is, or at least happened for me, is the one day at a time then just became, I don't think about alcohol anymore. I've lost the desire to drink. I don't struggle with this. And so I think one day at a time can be really helpful in the beginning. But it can also feel heavy depending on how you're looking at it.
Right. And I think that's the big promise, right? I think you just hit the big promise there, right? Which is that there is a way in which it seems impossible right now, but there will come a day where you don't want a drink. And again, that seemed impossible to me in the beginning.
Me
Literally,
too.
I mean, I would hear that and I would think that there's no way. Like, all I want is a drink, right? And I want it so bad. And yet the problem, like for most of us, if we're able to stay sober for a period of time, it goes away. It just disappears. which is bizarre. It's bizarre to me, the level of non-reaction to alcohol that I have. Right before this interview, I'm in a studio here, and they entertain here. And so I had a sandwich, and I went to the refrigerator, and I opened it up, and I put the sandwich in. And since they do, have events here, it is just stocked with beer and hard seltzer and all kinds of stuff. It might as well have been a fridge full of like cow piss. I mean, it just didn't have any, it didn't gross me out. I guess if it was a fridge full of cow piss, yeah. I would have a stronger reaction than I did. I just didn't, I didn't think about it. I wasn't like, oh, that's alcohol. That's careful. I better not have it. It just didn't even really think about it.
Yeah, I love that so much. When you were saying that, I was thinking, last summer, even, I took my daughter to Taylor Swift in LA, and I was very aware of the moms drinking and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, they're not going to even get to the third era because they're going to be feeling awful. And then I just took her this last weekend because she came to London then here a year later, and it was everywhere. And I got in the car and I was like, oh, I didn't even really notice it this time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I always find it in a little bit for me of a warning sign if I start noticing it. Mm-hmm. Right? If I suddenly am noticing people's oh, there's a glass of wine over there, and there's someone else has got tequila. And if it starts pulling my attention, even subtly, I usually just ask myself okay, what's going on inside? Because that is almost non-existent for me most of the time, which again, I think we're both sharing this in a message of hope for people that mm-hmm. Because if I had to live the way I felt early on with this feeling like I was torn in two, half of me being you can't do it, and the other half of me being you have to do it. If I had to live the rest of my life that way, it would be awful. It's an awful mm-hmm. feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, but it goes away, which is the good news. Or none of us would actually probably manage to stay sober if you felt that way all the time.
Yeah, 100%. That's cognitive dissonance at its finest, right? I was just going to say, it's just, I really want it, but I don't want it, and all of that. And that's why if you get under the subconscious conditioning, under all these reasons, under these assumptions, under the jobs, whatever you want to call it, and kind of call that stuff out, but then also feel it and feel the difference, that's when you get to start, I think, feeling this hope. And I love that so much because that's all I want, is this to be a conversation of hope and freedom and all of that. And for people not to feel alone if you feel your drinking looks like everybody else around you, but in your soul that it's not feeling good.
Yep. And that's the ultimate measure, right? It's not about how often you drink or what time of day you drink or whether you've had a DUI or those are not the thing, right? The thing is, how do you feel about it? And most people know how they feel about it, right? Mm-hmm. If you ask yourself that, there's something in you that goes, ugh.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't feel right. And that doesn't mean you get sober. I didn't feel right for a long time. I ignored it as best I could, but it wasn't that far into my substance use career where I noticed this doesn't, something feels wrong.
Yeah, 100%. I talk about in the book about values and how drinking just moved me really far away from those values that I held really dear, dependability and honesty and learning and all of these things that had been something that was really important to me. And just the little ways that alcohol kind of chipped away at that, right? Of not being so dependable because maybe I would cancel because I had a hangover, or just totally not learning, not reading books because who has time to read when you're just downing wine every night?
Right.
And so that moving slower and slowly away from the person that you feel like you want to be or what you hold as values was something that when I kind of looked back, I was like, oh, okay, it wasn't a massive DUI. It wasn't all these things, but it was this, and that is enough to look at it in a grace-filled way.
One of the things that people often do is they get a little bit of time sober, and they start to feel better, and then they survey their life and they see all sorts of other stuff that feels like it suddenly needs to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
What do you caution people to do in that situation?
Well, I think first of all, it's to, if you feel like alcohol is something that you want to look at, start with that and don't do all these other things. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of women that come to me and they're like, okay, I want to ditch alcohol and I want to train for a marathon and I want to cut gluten. I want blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, let's focus on one thing at a time, right? Because there's so much science about habit change that says if you put too many new things in, that they all end up failing. But I actually love that when alcohol then finally is out of the picture, that you do get to look at these other things. Mm-hmm. And they're things that I don't think, at least for me, I didn't see it coming, right? Things like learning to sit with hard emotions. Things like learning how to express and keep boundaries because supporting the unmet need of being alone or rest or whatever it is. And so again, it's kind of this work that we get to do. And I think it slowly presents itself when alcohol is out of the picture because alcohol tends to muddy all of this other stuff. Mm-hmm. But I guess my advice is not to do it all at once. If you feel like alcohol is the thing that's keeping you stuck, to focus on that and then see what comes up from it. And one of my favorite things about coaching is push comes to shove, it actually never is about alcohol. It's about so much more about what's underneath it. And so... Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's this subtle balance because I agree with you. Like trying to take on too much is very often a recipe for success. I mean, I talk about this all the time. Small steps, or little by little, a little becomes a lot. These ideas, and there are also things though that we can do that we could add to our life that make perhaps staying off the alcohol easier. You talk about joyful movement as an example.
Yeah. Joyful movement, 100%, because of also what it does to our brain chemistry. Mm-hmm. I think there was and I think maybe some of your women listeners can relate to this. I had to actually ditch the word exercise and lean into more calling it joyful exercise because it was about the feeling good and not necessarily about how I wanted to be smaller or skinnier or change my body. Yep. That was something that came up in my journey of after I ditched alcohol. Eating protein, because protein balances blood sugar. And if you have a more stable blood sugar, cravings aren't going to be as intense, especially, as you go throughout the day. And so there's lots of these little things that I talk about in the book. Bookending your day, starting with something in the morning, whether it's a book or a podcast or meditation or journaling, but then also ending your day with something so you have something at either end of the day. And this is all experimentation to see what kind of works for you. One of the things that really helped me that also really helps clients is, for example, if a walk is really serving you and it's making you feel really good and you know that at 9 o'clock after you drop the kids at school or whatever, that is something that's going to set you up for success during the day, is to actually get out your calendar, whether it's a paper one or your iPhone or whatever, and put that in as a non-negotiable. And really have that time scheduled. And I also did that, and I have to actually come back to it sometimes, right? When I'm busy with clients or kids and everything, it's like, oh, I feel like I'm running on empty at the end of the day. And I look back and I didn't get my walk and I didn't do my journaling and I didn't do my things. And so to put that in as non-negotiable, especially in the beginning, was super, super helpful.
Yeah, it is interesting the way as we get busy, we tend to jettison the things that allow us to perform well enough to remain busy, I guess would be the way to say it. Or as life gets more stressful, the first things that we throw out are the things that help us cope with stress.
Yeah. And I mean, it's overused, the phrase, but you really cannot pour from an empty cup. You just can't. You cannot give to others in the same way if you're not taking care of yourself.
We've sort of covered this a little bit, but I want to hit on it a little bit more directly, which is redefining self-care. You say one of the most pervasive messages we face in our society, especially as women, is that drinking is a form of self-care.
Yeah. And again, it gets back to that, what is true, right? Is if if it's supposed to make you feel better, if it's supposed to serve you, it's supposed to give you something like rest or coping or connection, does alcohol really, really do that? Mm-hmm. And we're also up against a society of social media where it's wine is self-care, but also going to get an expensive massage is self-care, or, you know, a lot of anything related to the spa is self-care, or shopping is self-care. And it's really looking at the truth of all that, right? Because self-care might just actually be going to bed an hour early, or making your budget, or these things that actually set you up for success, that make you feel better and allow you to stick to your goals. But we're up against the conditioning, just like with alcohol, where self-care is like, let's do more things, buy more things. And it doesn't have to be that. And so I talk about that in the book of redefine it. Like, what actually do you need? For me, honestly, sometimes it's going to bed an hour before the kids and just saying, you know, they're old enough to do this now. Put yourself to bed. and it's not this like really flashy, exciting thing that it makes a glamorous Instagram post, but it is true. It's true self-care for me. Or saying no, right? Saying no to the parties, saying no to the committees, saying no to the extra responsibility at work. Like that is also self-care. And so it's just kind of like flipping that on its head. Of one of the things I talk about in the book is, for example, you know, one day waking up, the run might be good self-care, but also sleeping in might be self-care. And a good way to measure that is, what do you feel like when you get home from the run? Are you so glad you did it, or are you more exhausted? What do you feel like when you get home from that dinner party that you might feel like obligatory? Did you feel good that you went, or did it feel like a drain? And so figuring it out kind of that way. And again, it's going against all the pervasive social media and messaging of society and getting under the hood of like, what's real and what's just not.
Did you and do you encourage clients to change their relationship with social media if the messages that they are getting are consistently pointing at the wrong thing for them?
One thing, it's obviously very, very individual. One thing I do say is that if someone is enjoying it and doesn't feel like they need to address it, is at least go in and unfollow the accounts that are promoting, for example, mommy wine culture. Right. And the second you do that, right, now the algorithm's so smart that it'll stop feeding that stuff to you. But if it feels like that ends up taking place, for example, of alcohol, like if you feel like that's the thing that you're using then to numb out, then look at how it actually is making you feel. If you're scrolling Instagram for an hour, does it make you feel better? Does it make you feel more connected? Does it bring you joy? Or does it do the opposite of that thing? You can apply kind of all the same questions.
Yeah, I think that's such a useful way to frame up this idea is, did it end up making me feel better, right? Because self-indulgence is not the same thing as self-care. They could be the same activity sometimes, but sometimes not, right? And I think what you're saying is go a little bit deeper and ask yourself, like, did that actually move the needle on me feeling better? You know, I think that's like with me, I don't really do really any social media anymore. But when I did, I was able to notice this thing that about the first 15 minutes of it felt enjoyable. I was stimulated and I was like, oh, look, I see this thing and that's interesting and like it felt good. But then somewhere around the 15 to 20 minute mark, if I paid close attention to myself, something shifted. Something shifted where it just suddenly I started to it just didn't feel good anymore.
Yeah,
and it's
so similar to alcohol.
Easy to go right by that, right? Because you're distracted. That's part of why they work the way they do, is they distract you. But there is usually a subtle feeling there.
Yeah, 100%. I was just gonna say it's so similar to alcohol, right? Because it's the same dopamine response.
Yeah, interestingly, I had not heard of dynorphin before. Let's close with a little bit more about dynorphin, because that was, it's rare that I read, I've been doing this for a decade and reading thousands so many of these books that I can't believe I haven't heard of dynorphin before. Tell me more.
So I mean, we know about dopamine, right? It's the feel good chemical. It's also the learning molecule in the brain. So we learn, it feels good. We cement these neural pathways in our head. But when we drink or do any substances, we get this artificial level of dopamine. And since our brains are desperate to bring us back to homeostasis, it releases a counter chemical called dynorphin, which basically brings you down, right? It's a sedative, it's a downer. And what ends up happening when you're a regular drinker is your body gets so used to the incoming massive spikes of artificial dopamine that it releases more and more dynorphin. And so you cannot get or feel joy or happiness without the massive amounts of dopamine, aka alcohol, because you're flooded with this opposing chemical. And how that looks in real life for me was realizing that I would be sitting at my daughter's ballet recital or my son's baseball game, and I was like, this is not fun because there's no alcohol. And that is because of this other thing. And it also ties into, right, how we were talking about 20 minutes. The dopamine hits you for 20 minutes, and then this other chemical, the evil brother, whatever, comes in and does the opposite. And so it's just a really interesting way to understand all of the neuroscience of what actually is happening and get to the truth of, is it actually doing the job that we're drinking it for?
Yep. That's one of the other things that makes addiction, I'm going to use the word, we could use alcohol use disorder, but I'm just going to broadly say addiction. So pernicious is that thing that you're describing there, which is this, our neurochemicals are all messed up. And so we may not be producing enough of the chemicals that make us feel good, or we may be overproducing the chemicals that tamp down that response. And you take the alcohol away or the substance, and you can't, you have the inability to enjoy pleasure. So then somebody says, well, go to a pottery class instead of drinking wine. And you go to the pottery class and you're like, so what, who cares? Like, that was stupid, right? Like that did not make me feel any better. I was uncomfortable. I didn't know anybody. And it's, again, why I think that having support early on in any sort of sobriety journey is so, so important. Because just to hear somebody else say, that's normal, just hang in there. Like, of course, you can't feel good, but I felt the same way. And you know what? It gets better.
Yeah.
Whether it's a coach like you, whether it's an online group, whether it's a 12-step program, I just feel like that's the one, like, people often ask me, like, well, what's what's the one thing that someone has to do to get sober? I'm like, well, I would never boil it down to one thing because I think it's complicated. But if you at gunpoint forced me, I would probably say help from other people who've been through it. That would probably be, if I had to make one recommendation, I'd say that one is sort of the non-negotiable on the table, I think.
Yes, 100%. Community all the way. It's because you don't feel alone. Then the shame also evaporates, because when you speak something that feels shameful in a group, that helps with the shame piece of it. And when you can hear other people saying, yes, when I went to that party and turned down the glass of wine, it was so weird and I felt like a fish out of water for 15 minutes. But then 20 minutes in, I was fine and I was able to be okay. Then you know it's possible for you too. And so, yes, 100%. I totally agree with you. Community. And that can come in different forms, right? Whether it is a 12-step meeting or even just connecting with the sober podcast host that you like listening to, or whatever. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the thing. There are a lot of ways to get it. The world is so, like, when I got sober in 1994, there was one place to hear any of this, and it was in a 12-step room. That was it. It just didn't exist in any meaningful way outside of that. I mean, the internet didn't exist. It's so different today. I mean, we have so many resources and different ways of plugging in. And that's the other one I always say. We used to say it in AA, like, keep coming back, right? Which meant, essentially meant keep trying. And I think that's the other message that I think is so important is, you don't have to keep coming back to AA. That's not it. But keep trying. Keep experimenting, because there is a way out.
Yeah, 100%. And with all the grace and compassion in yourself, knowing that alcohol is a highly addictive drug and this is hard, but there's nothing wrong with you. There's a lot wrong with alcohol. and you'll get there. You'll get there. You'll find that, to use what you said, right? The puzzle pieces that work, and it will happen.
Well, that is a beautiful place for us to end the conversation on that note of hope. Christy, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much.
If what you just heard was helpful to you, please consider making a monthly donation to support the One You Feed podcast. When you join our membership community with this monthly pledge, you get lots of exclusive members-only benefits. It's our way of saying thank you for your support. Now, we are so grateful for the members of our community. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without their support, and we don't take a single dollar for granted. To learn more, make a donation at any level, and become a member of the One You Feed community, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. The One You Feed podcast would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for supporting the show.